Hello, may I welcome you on behalf of the MAN B&W diesel team. This video film is intended to inform you about essential servicing jobs on your diesel engines. A correct performance of these jobs is of great significance for trouble-free operation of these technically perfected engines. This video film comprehensively describes the jobs you need to carry out on inlet and exhaust valves. In the first part of the video, we introduced you to valves and valve seats. We've shown you the main checking and adjustment procedures and how to remove components, as well as how to go about assessing components. Let's move on now to tackling plant maintenance work. You'll be taken through the procedure in 6 steps. Let's begin with a correct sequence and a look at the tools you'll be needing. In the next 3 steps, we'll be showing you how to grind the valve cone, how to grind and mill the cage seat, and how to grind the valve seat. Then we'll summarize the safety aspects. Finally, in the last step, we'll look at assembly and final check. This video film is thought as a supplementation of written pieces of information of the technical documentation, that is, the operation instructions and the working instructions. It is no substitute for this written information. We shall use this symbol as a reference to the relevant working cards. Please read them carefully prior to starting on the job. Safety first. Always remember this principle when doing maintenance work. This symbol is used to mark significant notes on how injury to persons or damage to components can be avoided. We are convinced that this video film will be of valuable assistance to you in doing your responsible job. We wish you every success.
Overhauling work on valves and valve seats must be carried out in a specific sequence. First the valve cone, then the valve cage, and then the valve seat. Valve cones have to be ground before valve seats because they are needed for performing the inking test on the valve seat. The cage seats in the cylinder head and at the valve cage must also be ground or milled before the valve seats if you want to ensure you achieve the final assembly condition when grinding the valve seats. We'll be showing the work in this sequence. You have a whole range of tools available to you to help you carry out this work correctly. The most important ones are the grinding machine for the cage seat and the valve seat grinder with its accompanying measuring device. We'll be showing you how to work with Hunger machines. You could work equally well with the machines produced by Chris Marine. The valve seat grinder, the valve cone grinder, the milling set for removing major faults in the cage seat of the cylinder head, and the grinding device for the outer valve cage seat are not included in the standard tool set. You will have to buy these tools separately. Before grinding the valve cone, do make sure you test the material. You can identify the materials by their magnetic properties. Armoured steel valves are magnetic. Valves made of Nimonic 80A are not. This is important because different limits apply depending on the material being remachined. These you'll find in the work cards. Familiarize yourself with the grinding machine before you start using it and make sure it's working properly. Make sure you always wear protective goggles, not only when dressing the grinding wheels, but also when grinding. You should always begin by dressing the grinding wheel. The front face must lie parallel to the axis. Whenever you insert a new grinding wheel, always test run it for approximately 1 minute. Make sure you never stand in the path of the spin. Now insert the valve cone in the tool spindle and clamp it in the collar in order to avoid vibrations. Use a cock spanner to tighten the tension nut until it is hand tight. Tap the floor of the valve plate with a suitable tool in order to center the collet chuck. Then retighten the clamping nut. Now check the concentricity of the valve cone at 2 points using a dial gauge. The readings should not exceed the limit values. Prior to grinding, adjust the grinding wheel so that the center of the grinding wheel is facing the center of the seating surface. Now switch the machine on and feed the slide slowly until the seating surface starts to be ground. Always use a coolant during grinding. Move the grinding wheel backwards and forwards by hand. Make sure that the grinding wheel always remains on the valve seat. Keep grinder feed to a minimum so as to avoid chatter marks. Half a graduation mark, roughly equivalent to 0.02 of a millimeter, is sufficient. Make sure you feed enough coolant into the key between the grinding wheel and the valve cone seating surface. Make sure that you don't grind the seat too wide. Be very careful not to grind into the valve cone radius. You'll find the maximum values in the work cards. You can tell when the grinding wheel is no longer removing material by the fact that the volume of the grinding noise increases. This tells you that you need to redress the grinding wheel. You'll need to dress the grinding wheel more frequently when grinding mnemonic valve cones because they cause it to wear more quickly and exert pressure. At all events, make sure you redress the grinding wheel before you perform the final grind. The condition is satisfactory prior to the final pass if the seating surface is completely clean and shows no chatter marks. For the final pass, you only need set a small amount of feed, less than 0.02 mm is sufficient, then grind completely. Move the valve cone seating surface away from the grinding wheel after the final pass. Then break the burr at the outer diameter. Mnemonic valves may have a bulge. Remove this with a file. Finally, remeasure the width of the seating surface. It should not exceed the limit value, which varies depending on the material used. You may encounter shallow corrosion grooves at the transition from the base valve plate material to the armouring. We've already shown you how to make these grooves visible by crack testing. The outer diameter can be reground using a portable grinder and a flexible grinding wheel. The diameter should be no more than 0.5 mm smaller. Make sure valves in valve cages are seated correctly in the cylinder head. This may necessitate you remachining the seat in the cylinder head and possibly also the seating surface at the valve cage. You can grind the cage seat in the cylinder head, although it is better to do it in the turning device. Grinding can be performed in a number of ways. You can coat the hardened grinding wheel with grinding paste or glue on pre-cut grinding plates. Grinding plates tend to produce better results. Once you start using the grinding device, you must attach the guide wheel. This stops the grinding wheel becoming distorted. The current design of tool also has an additional pressure plate. Then attach the extension and the tap wrench. Turn the tap wrench back and forth to grind. Lift the tool occasionally in order to alter the position. Finally, check the state of the seat. The seating surface should be as polished and score-free as possible over the entire surface. Here you can see the surface before grinding. And now after grinding. The condition of the inner area is particularly important. Slight blemishes at the larger diameter can be tolerated. Once this state has been reached, you must carefully clean the seating surface. If the seat has been reground or remilled several times, you should also check dimension B. For this, you can use a measuring device with a dial gauge. Before use, it has to be set to 0. If the gap measured is smaller than permitted, the cylinder head must be replaced and reconditioned at an authorized service center. Otherwise, you run the risk of the piston coming into contact with the valve. The surface can also be re-milled if it is obvious from the outset that grinding will not get it clean. A facing head can be ordered for this purpose as a special purpose tool. We recommend you pre-grind the seat in order to remove the hard surface layer. You can use the facing head with the pressure plate mentioned earlier. Please note, make sure you check dimension B both before and after milling. Defects on the valve cage seating face can also be removed using a special purpose tool. It comprises a rotatable slip ring and a flange pair with handles. You are advised to use pre-cut grinding plates. If manual grinding no longer produces the desired result, the valve cage can be returned at an authorized service center. To grind the valve seat, the valve cage must be fitted in the cylinder head and correctly tightened. The cage seating surfaces must be in order. Clearly, assembly is performed in reverse sequence to dismantling. What is important is that for regrinding of the valve seat, there is still sufficient clearance to measuring edge D. Fit new O-ring seals before starting reassembly. Insert the valve cone into the valve cage without the springs or rotator. Then screw the suspension nut onto the valve cone. This will enable you to suspend the valve cage from the lifting tackle. Now coat the cage surface area with Molykote HSC, but not the cage seat. Recheck that the valve cage seat and the bore in the cylinder head are clean. Grease the O-ring seals thoroughly. Now move the valve cage carefully into the cylinder head. Make sure that the positioning pin engages with its counterpart. Coat the seating surfaces of the hexagon nuts and the thread with Molykote HSC. Then attach the flange, screw on the nuts, and tighten to the specified torque. Continue tightening in the specified angle of rotation in further steps. You'll find the torque values in the work card entitled Tightening Torques. A key piece of work in preparation for grinding the valve seat is to measure the valve seat surface. This tells you the gradient of the seating surface, which is the result of natural deformation. The rod for guiding the grinding machine is then adjusted so that the gradient is retained during grinding, and only a slight amount of regrinding is required. For this work, the cylinder head with the combustion chamber surface must be inclined upwards. Recheck the condition of the valve guide and clean if necessary. Be careful to remove coke deposits at the 30-degree slant, which will later contact with the pilot. Insert the pilot until the centering cone contacts the top of the valve guide. Now screw the nut with centrical taper adapter from below onto the pilot. Ensure that the cone engages in the valve guide. Now turn the turning device so that the combustion chamber surface is facing upwards. Slip the measuring device over the pilot and clamp tightly at about measuring level using the lock bolt. This measuring device cannot be used with the 3240 engine because the valve diameter is smaller. Set the dial gauge so that the feeler is seated at the outer third of the slant of the valve seat. Then tighten the lock bolts of the guide rods. Slowly turn the measuring device through a full turn. While doing so, observe the dial gauge reading. Turn the dial gauge to the highest point and set the indicator to 0. Then turn the measuring device to the lowest point. The difference between the two readings is the figure for the tilt of the valve seat. Using a felt tip pen, mark the lowest point of the valve seat. If the difference in the measured values is greater than 0.1 mm, replace the centrical adapter with an eccentric one. Select an adapter about equal to half the difference. The eccentric taper adapters are marked at their thickest point. Make sure that the marking on the adapter points in the same direction as your own marking. This ensures that the pilot is aligned in such a way that the seating surface produced during subsequent grinding best corresponds to the starting position. Just to make sure, carry out another measurement. The difference value must not exceed 0.1 mm. Now you can detach the measuring device. Now fit a centering device, if provided. It will improve the stability of the pilot. Push the centering device onto the pilot sufficiently far to ensure adequate clearance to the grinding wheel and lock by tightening the clamping screw. Finally, lock the thrust bolts by tightening the set screws. Before starting the grinding machine, make sure you read the relevant work cards and consult the instructions provided by the manufacturer. It is important that you familiarize yourself with the machine. Please make sure you use the original grinding wheels. They are of exactly the right hardness for the valve seats. When attaching a new grinding wheel, make sure you insert a paper disc on each side. This marks the limit beyond which the wheel should not be allowed to be worn down. Always wear protective goggles whenever you are doing grinding work. Test the grinding wheel by allowing it to run for 1 minute. Shape the grinding wheel on both sides by tapering the side faces. Dress the front face in steps to 15 degrees. The width of pass on the grinding wheel circumference should be roughly 4 mm. Finish by slightly rounding the edges. Vibrations transmitted to the turning device can cause chatter marks during machining. You should therefore perform grinding work under vibration-free conditions and in the resiliently mounted machining unit. Lubricate the front face of the pilot with a few drops of machine oil. Position the grinder and prepare for use. With the counter nut loosened, insert the grinding spindle slide into the prismatic guide. Move the grinding spindle slide by turning the setting screw until the circumferential surface of the grinding wheel is above the valve seat. Perform coarse adjustment by carefully lowering the grinder, having loosened the clamping screw, until the grinding wheel is slightly above the valve seat. Fix the machine in this position. Now you can connect the main machine to the grinder. Lower the grinder to valve seat level using the fine feed setting. Loosen the red screw and then turn the graduated ring counterclockwise until the grinding wheel is slightly touching the valve seat at the highest point. Position the grinder on the inside diameter and lock the set screw. Secure the grinder to prevent it twisting. Switch on the grinder. Now you can grind the seating surface from the inside to the outside. It is extremely important that you remove as little material as possible, just enough to produce a smooth surface, so that the outer half of the seat presents a smooth surface free of scoring. To feed the grinder when at standstill, lift using the adjusting screw. Move the grinder inwards and lock the setting screw. Adjust the graduated ring. Then lower the grinder, switch it on and set in motion by turning the control knob. For final grinding, select a feed rate of no more than 0.025 mm, equivalent to half a graduation mark. To improve the surface, the seating surface should be coated with clean oil during final grinding, after which you should make another pass without feed. Again, grind from the inside to the outside. Do not exceed the D edge as the wear limit. Each regrinding increases the outer diameter of the valve seat. This should always be the same as the outer diameter of the valve cone, however. To ensure this, you will need to regrind the front face of the valve seat rings or valve cages until you reach the diameter specified in the work cards. To do this, you must dress the grinding wheel parallel to the cylinder head. Make sure you don't start grinding the cylinder head. After machining, clean all surfaces, in particular those of the valve guide and seating surface. To test how successful the regrinding has been, you must now conduct an inking test. To do this, the valve cage must be fitted. You can use the existing valve cone, which has already been ground, or a new original valve cone. Clamp the touching bow to the valve plate. Paint on a thin layer of ink and spread it evenly. Now insert the valve cone and, pressing lightly, move it backwards and forwards. If the grinding has been carried out properly, the outer edge of the seat should have a smooth surface down to about the center of the seat. Before we show you the final work, we'd just like to re-summarize the most important safety rules. Please follow these rules. It is in your own interest and that of the operational safety of your engine. Remember the correct sequence. First, the valve cone. Then the cage seat. Then the valve seat. To grind the valve seat, the valve cage must be fitted and correctly tightened. Adjust the pilot carefully when grinding valve seats. You'll find you'll save both time and material. Use the proper grinding wheels. Make sure you test run them and never perform any dressing or grinding work without wearing safety goggles. Vibrations can cause chatter marks on the seating surfaces. You should therefore perform grinding work under vibration-free conditions and in the resiliently mounted machining unit. Don't exceed the limit values. Avoid any work where there is a risk that the relevant limits might be exceeded. With the valve cage fitted, work we've already shown you, the next step is to fit the valve cone. To do this, insert a new O-ring seal in the valve guide and grease it. Push the valve, with the stem greased, into the valve guide. Fit the valve springs and the grease thrust bearing with the spring plate. Attach the valve spring tensioner and clamp the valve spring sufficiently to allow the cone pieces to be fitted. They should be seated in the groove, not in the thread runout. In the 4860 engine, the gap between valve plate and piston is only a few millimeters. If you carry out overhauling work correctly, this gap becomes smaller, but this is not critical. If earlier overhauling work has made you unsure, we strongly recommend you perform the gap check using a glued-on strip of flat lead. See the work cards for further information. We have tried to explain a complex subject by providing useful background knowledge, interesting examples, and by explaining the work step by step. If you carry out the work in the way shown, your engine will give you many months of reliable service. It's worth the effort.
Well, I think this video film appropriately illustrates the maintenance jobs to be done. And please remember, the work cards included in the technical documentation contain more technical details. You should take recourse to this source of information whenever you have to do maintenance work. Should you encounter difficulties, please don't hesitate to contact our diesel team in Augsburg or Hamburg or one of our service bases all over the world. We wish you good success with your work and trouble-free operation of our MAN, B&W diesel engines at all times.